Hi, welcome back to Storytime. I noticed about an hour ago, Tristis dropped a follow. If you are lurking out there, Tristis, thank you so much for the follow. So today we are returning to the land of Oz with the fourth book, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. And I wish you could see the cover of this book that I am reading. It is beautiful. I've kind of been wanting to read the second volume in the complete collection just because of this cover. It's beautiful. If I can remember, I'll put it in the Discord. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started. We'll see if Alfred Baum drops any more inconsistencies in there, like with, I noticed in the I think it was in number 3 when all of a sudden the Tin Woodman had a name, Nick Chopper. I'm still not sure what I think about that, which of course it makes sense because he was originally a Munchkin before, he became the Tin Woodman in a very gruesome way. So, here's hoping that things are a little less crazy. I'm kind of excited that I get to have this image, this drawing that I did my very first actually Storytime art that I did, and I was starting to play with some textures. I really like how it turned out, especially with the Cowardly Lion. Anyways, let me take a sip and we'll go ahead and get started. So, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, Chapter 1, The Earthquake. The train from Frisco was very late. It should have arrived at Hugson's Siding at midnight, but it was already 5 o'clock and the gray dawn was breaking in the east when the little train slowly rolled up to the open shed that served for the station house. As it came to a stop, the conductor called out in a loud voice, "Hudson Siding!" At once a little girl rose from her seat and walked to the door of the car, carrying a wicker suitcase in one hand and a round birdcage covered up with the newspaper in the other, while a parasol was tucked under her arm. The conductor helped her off the car, and then the engineer started his train again, so that it puffed and groaned and moved slowly away up the track. The reason he was so late was because all through the night there were times when the solid earth shook and trembled under him, and the engineer was afraid that at any moment the rails might spread apart and an accident happen to his passengers. So he moved the cars slowly and with caution. The little girl stood still to watch until the train had disappeared round the curve. Then she turned to see where she was. The shed of Hugson's Siding was bare save for an old wooden bench, and did not look very inviting. As she peered through the soft gray light, not a house of any sort was visible near the station, nor was any person in sight. But after a while the child discovered a horse and buggy standing near a group of trees a short distance away. She walked towards it and found the horse tied to a tree and standing motionless, with its head hanging down almost to the ground. It was a big horse, tall and bony, with long legs and large knees and feet. She could count his ribs easily where they showed through the skin of his body, and his head was long and seemed altogether too big for him, as if it did not fit. His tail was short and scraggly, and his harness had been broken in many places and fastened all together again with cords and bits of wire. The buggy seemed almost new, for it had a shiny top and side curtains. Getting round in front, so that she could look inside, the girl saw a boy curled up on the seat, fast asleep. She set down the birdcage and poked the boy with her parasol. Presently he woke up, rose to a sitting position, and rubbed his eyes briskly. "Hello there," he said, seeing her. "Are you Dorothy Gale?" "Yes," she answered, looking gravely at his tousled hair and blinking gray eyes. "Have you come to take me to Hugson's ranch?" "Of course," he answered. "Train in?" "I couldn't be here if it wasn't," she said. He laughed at that, and his laugh was merry and frank. Jumping up out of the buggy, he put Dorothy's suitcase under the seat and her birdcage on the floor in front. "Canary birds?" he asked. "Oh, no, it's just Eureka, my kitten. I thought that was the best way to carry her." The boy nodded. "Eureka's a funny name for a cat," he remarked. "I named my kitten that because I found it," she explained. "Uncle Henry says Eureka means I found it." "All right, hop in." She climbed into the buggy, and he followed her. Then the boy picked up the reins, shook them, and said, "Get up." The horse did not stir. Dorothy thought he just wiggled one of his dropping ears, but that was all. "Get up!" cried the boy again. The horse stood still. "Perhaps," said Dorothy, "if you untied him, he would go." The boy laughed cheerfully and jumped out. "Guess I'm half asleep yet," he said, untying the horse. "But Jim knows his business all right, don't you, Jim?" patting the long nose of the animal. Then he got into the buggy again and took the reins, and the horse at once backed away from the tree, turned slowly around, and began to trot down the sandy road, which was just visible in the dim light. "Thought that train would never come," observed the boy. "I've waited at that station for 5 hours." "We have a lot of earthquakes," said Dorothy. "Didn't you feel the ground shake?" "Yes, but we're used to such things in California," he replied. "They don't scare us much." The conductor said it was the worst quake he ever knew. "Did he?" "It must have happened while I was asleep," he said thoughtfully. "How's Uncle Henry?" she inquired, after a pause during which the horse continued to trot with long, regular strides. "He's pretty well. He and Uncle Hugson have been having a fine visit." "Is Mr. Hugson your uncle?" she asked. "Yes, Uncle Bill Hugson married your Uncle Henry's wife's sister, so we must be second cousins," said the boy, in an amused tone. "I work for Uncle Bill on his ranch, and he pays me $6 a month in my board." "Isn't that a great deal?" she asked doubtfully. "Why, it's a great deal for Uncle Hudson, but not for me. I'm a splendid worker. I work as well as I sleep," he added with a laugh. "What's your name?" said Dorothy, thinking she liked the boy's manner and the cheery tone of his voice. "Not a very pretty one," he answered, as if a little ashamed. "My whole name is Zebediah, but folks just call me Zeb. You've been to Australia, haven't you?" "Yes, with Uncle Henry," she answered. "We got to San Francisco a week ago, and Uncle Henry went right on to Hugson's ranch for a visit while I stayed a few days in the city with some friends we had met." "How long will you be with us?" he asked. "Only a day. Tomorrow Uncle Henry and I must start back for Kansas. We've been away for a long time, you know, and so we're anxious to get back home again." The boy flicked the big, bony horse with his whip and looked thoughtful. Then he started to say something to his little companion, but before he could speak, the buggy began to sway dangerously from side to side, and the earth seemed to rise up before them. Next minute there was a roar and a sharp crash, and at her side Dorothy saw the ground open in a wide crack and then come together again. "Goodness!" she cried, grasping the iron rail of the seat. "What was that?" "That was an awful big quake," replied Zeb with a white face. "It almost got us that time, Dorothy." The horse had stopped short and stood firm as a rock. Zeb shook the reins and urged him to go, but Zeb was stubborn. Then the boy cracked his whip and touched the animal's flanks with it, and after a low moan of protest, Jim stepped slowly along the road. Neither the boy nor the girl spoke again for some minutes. There was a breath of danger in the very air, and every few moments the earth would shake violently. Jim's ears were standing erect upon his head, and every muscle of his big body was tense as he trotted toward home. He was not going very fast, but on his flanks specks of foam began to appear, and at times he would tremble like a leaf. The sky had grown darker again, and the wind made queer sobbing sounds as if it wept over the valley. Suddenly there was a rending, tearing sound, and the earth split into another great crack just beneath the spot where the horse was standing. With a wild neigh of terror, the animal fell bodily into the pit, drawing the buggy and its occupants after him. Dorothy grabbed hold fast hold of the buggy top, and the boy did the same. The sudden rush into space confused them so that they could not think. Blackness engulfed them on every side, and in breathless silence they waited for the fall to end and crush them against jagged rocks, or for the earth to close in upon them again and bury them forever in its dreadful depths. The horrible sensation of falling, the darkness and the terrifying noises proved more than Dorothy could endure, and for a few moments the little girl lost consciousness. Zeb, being a boy, did not faint, but he was badly frightened and clung to the buggy seat with a tight grip, expecting every moment would be his last. Chapter 2. The Glass City. When Dorothy recovered her senses, they were still falling, but not so fast. The top of the buggy caught the air like a parachute or an umbrella filled with wind, and held them back so that they floated downwards with a gentle motion that was not so very disagreeable to bear. The worst thing was their terror of reaching the bottom of this great crack in the earth, and the natural fear that sudden death was about to overtake them at any moment. Crash after crash echoed far above their heads as the earth came together where it had split, and stones and chunks of clay rattled round them on every side. These they could not see, but they could feel them pelting the buggy top, and Jim screamed almost like a human being when a stone overtook him and struck his bony body. They did not really hurt the poor horse, because everything was falling together, only the stones and rubbish fell faster than the horse and buggy, which were held back by the pressure of the air, so that the terrified animal was actually more frightened than he was injured. How long this state of things continued, Dorothy could not even guess. She was so greatly bewildered. But by and by, as she stared ahead into the black chasm with a beating heart, she began to dimly see the form of the horse Jim, his head up in the air, his ears erect, and his long legs sprawled in every direction as he tumbled through space. Also, turning her head, she found that she could see the boy beside her, who had until now remained as still and silent as she herself. Dorothy sighed and commenced to breathe easier. She began to realize that death was not in store for her after all, but that she had merely started upon another adventure, which promised to be just as queer and unusual as were those she had before encountered. With this thought in mind, the girl took heart and leaned her head over the side of the buggy to see where the strange light was coming from. Far below her she found 6 great glowing balls suspended in the air. The central and largest one was white, and reminded her of the sun. Around it were arranged, like the 5 points of a star, the other 5 brilliant balls, one being rose-colored, one violet, one yellow, one blue, and one orange. This splendid group of colored suns sent rays darting in every direction as the horse and buggy, with Dorothy and Zeb, sank steadily downward and came nearer to the lights. The rays began to take on all the delicate tintings of a rainbow, growing more and more distinct every moment until all the space was brilliantly illuminated. Dorothy was too dazed to say much, but she watched one of Jim's big ears turn to violet and the other to rose, and wondered that his tail should be yellow and his body striped with blue and orange like the stripes of a zebra. Then she looked at Zeb, whose face was blue and whose hair was pink, and gave a little laugh that sounded a bit nervous. "Isn't it funny?" she said. The boy was startled, and his eyes were big. Dorothy had a green streak through the center of her face where the blue and yellow lights came together, and her appearance seemed to add to his fright. I don't see anything funny about it," he stammered. Just then the buggy tipped slowly over upon its side, the body of the horse tipping also. But they continued to fall all together, and the boy and the girl had no difficulty in remaining upon the seat, just as they were before. Then they turned bottom side up and continued to roll slowly over until they were right side up again. During this time, Jim struggled frantically, all his legs kicking the air, but on finding himself in his former position, the horse said, in a relieved tone of voice, "Well, that's better." Dorothy and Zeb looked at one another in wonder. "Oh, hey, Drink. Good to see you." "Can your horse talk?" she asked. "Never knew him to before," replied the boy. "Those were the first words I ever said," called out the horse, who had overheard them, "and I can't explain why I happened to speak them. This is a nice scrape you got me into, isn't it?" "As for that, we are in the same scrape ourselves," answered Dorothy cheerfully. "But never mind. Something will happen pretty soon." "Of course," growled the horse, "and then we shall be sorry it happened." Zeb gave a shiver. All this was so terrible and unreal that he could not understand it at all, and so had good reason to be afraid. Swiftly they drew near the flaming colored suns and passed close beside them. The light was then so bright that it dazzled their eyes, and they covered their faces with their hands to escape being blinded. There was no heat in the colored suns, however, and after they had passed below them, the top of the buggy shut out many of the piercing rays so that the boy and girl could open their eyes again. "We've got to come to the bottom sometime," remarked Zeb with a deep sigh. "We can't keep falling forever, you know." "Of course not," said Dorothy. "We're somewhere in the middle of the earth, and the chances are we'll reach the other side of it before long. But it's a big hollow, isn't it?" "Awful big," answered the boy. "We're coming to something now," announced the horse. At this they both put their heads over the side of the buggy and looked down. Yes, there was land below them, and not so very far away either. But they were floating very, very slowly, so slowly that it could no longer be called a fall, and the children had ample time to take heart and look about them. They saw a landscape with mountains and plains, lakes and rivers, very like those upon the earth's surface, but all the scene was splendidly colored by the variegated lights from the 6 suns. Here and there were groups of houses that seemed made of clear glass, because they sparkled so brightly. "I'm sure we're in no danger," said Dorothy in a sober voice. "We are falling so slowly that we can't be dashed to pieces when we land, and this country that we are coming to seems quite pretty." "We'll never get home again, though," declared Zeb with a groan. "Oh, I'm not so sure of that," replied the girl. "But don't let us worry over such things, Zeb. We can't help ourselves just now, you know, and I've always been told it's foolish to borrow trouble." The boy became silent, having no reply to so sensible a speech, and soon both were fully occupied in staring at the strange scenes spread out below them. They seemed to be falling right into the middle of a big city, which had many tall buildings with glass domes and sharp-pointed spires. These spires were like great spear points, and if they tumbled upon one of them, they were likely to suffer serious injury. Jim the horse had seen these spires also, and his ears stood straight up with fear, while Dorothy and Zeb held their breaths in suspense. But no, they floated gently down upon a broad, flat roof, and came to a stop at last. When Jim felt something firm under his feet, the poor beast's legs trembled so much that he could hardly stand. But Zeb at once leaped out of the buggy to the roof, and he was so awkward and hasty that he kicked over Dorothy's birdcage, which rolled out across the roof so that the bottom came off. At once a pink kitten crept out of the upset cage, sat down upon the glass roof, and yawned and blinked its round eyes. "Oh," said Dorothy, "there's Eureka." "First time I ever saw a pink cat," said Zeb. "Eureka isn't pink, she's white. It's this queer light that gives her that color." "Where's my milk?" asked the kitten, looking up into Dorothy's face. "I'm most starved to death." "Oh, Eureka, can you talk?" "Talk? Am I talking? Good gracious, I believe I am. Isn't it funny?" asked the kitten. "It's all wrong," said Zeb gravely. "Animals ought not to talk. But even old Jim has been saying things since we had our accident." "I can't see that it's wrong," remarked Jim in his gruff tones. "At least it isn't as wrong as some other things. What's going to become of us now?" "I don't know," answered the boy, looking round him curiously. The houses of the city were all made of glass so clear and transparent that one could look through the walls as easily as through a window. Dorothy saw, under the roof on which she stood, several rooms used for rest chambers, and even thought she could make out a number of queer forms huddled into the corners of these rooms. The roof beside them had a great hole smashed through it, and pieces of glass were lying scattered in every direction. A nearby steeple had been broken off short, and the fragments lay heaped beside it. Other buildings were cracked in places, or had corners chipped off from them, but they must have been very beautiful before these accidents had happened to mar their perfection. The rainbow tints from the colored suns fell upon the glass city softly, and gave to the buildings many delicate, shifting hues, which were very pretty to see. But not a sound had broken the stillness since the strangers had arrived, except that of their own voices. They began to wonder if there were no people to inhabit this magnificent city of the inner world. Suddenly a man appeared through a hole in the roof next to the one they were on, and stepped into plain view. He was not a very large man, but was well-formed and had a beautiful face, calm and serene as the face of a fine portrait. His clothing fitted his form snugly, and was gorgeously colored in brilliant shades of green, which varied as the sunbeams touched them, but was not wholly influenced by the solar rays. The man had taken a step or two across the glass roof before he noticed the presence of the strangers, but then he stopped abruptly. There was no expression of either fear or surprise upon his tranquil face, yet he must have been both astonished and afraid, for after his eyes had rested upon the ungainly form of the horse for a moment, he walked rapidly to the furthest edge of the roof, his head turned back over his shoulder to gaze at the strange animal. "Look out!" cried Dorothy, who noticed that the beautiful man did not look where he was going. "Be careful, or you'll fall off." But he paid no attention to her warning. He reached the edge of the tall roof, stepped 1 foot out into the air, and walked into space as calmly as if he were on firm ground. The girl, greatly astonished, ran to lean over the edge of the roof, and saw the man walking rapidly through the air toward the ground. Soon he reached the street and disappeared through a glass doorway into one of the glass buildings. "How strange!" she exclaimed, drawing a long breath. "Yes, but it's lots of fun if it is strange," remarked the small voice of the kitten, and Dorothy turned to find her pet walking in the air a foot or so away from the edge of the roof. "Come back, Eureka!" she called in distress. "You'll certainly be killed." "I have 9 lives," said the kitten, purring softly as it walked around in a circle and then came back to the roof. "But I can't lose even one of them by falling in this country, because I really couldn't manage to fall if I wanted to." "Oh, hey, Swags, good to see you." "Does the air bear up your weight?" asked the girl. "Of course, can't you see?" And again the kitten wandered into the air and back to the edge of the roof. "It's wonderful," said Dorothy. "I suppose we let Eureka go down to the street and get someone to help us," suggested Zeb, who had been even more amazed than Dorothy at these strange happenings. "Perhaps we can walk on the air ourselves," replied the girl. Zeb drew back with a shiver. "I wouldn't dare try," he said. "Maybe Jim will go," continued Dorothy, looking at the horse. "And maybe he won't," answered Jim. "I've tumbled through the air long enough to make me contented on this roof." "But we didn't tumble to the roof," said the girl. "By the time we reached here, we were floating very slowly, and I'm almost sure we could float down to the street without getting hurt. Eureka walks on the air all right." Eureka weighs only about half a pound," replied the horse in a scornful tone, "while I weigh about half a ton." "You don't weigh as much as you ought to, Jim," remarked the girl, shaking her head as she looked at the animal. "You're dreadfully skinny." "Oh, well, I'm old," said the horse, hanging his head despondently, "and I've had lots of trouble in my day, little one. For a good many years I drew a public cab in Chicago, and that's enough to make anyone skinny." "Heaps enough to get fat, I'm sure," said the boy gravely. Do I? Can you remember any breakfast that I've had today? Growled Jim, as if he resented Zeb's speech. None of us has had breakfast, said the boy, and in a time of danger like this, it's foolish to talk about eating. Nothing is more dangerous than being without food, declared the horse, with a sniff of at the rebuke of his young master. And just at present, no one can tell whether there are any oats in this queer country or not. If there are, they're liable to be glass oats. Oh no, cried Dorothy. I can see plenty of nice gardens and fields down below us at the edge of this city. But I wish we could find a way to get to the ground. Why don't you walk down? Asked Eureka. I'm as hungry as the horse is, and I want my milk. Will you try it, Zeb? Asked the girl, turning to her companion. Zeb hesitated. He was still pale and frightened, for this dreadful adventure had upset him and made him nervous and worried. But he did not wish the little girl to think him a coward, so he advanced slowly to the edge of the roof. Dorothy stretched out a hand to him, and Zeb put one foot out and let it rest in the air a little over the edge of the roof. It seemed firm enough to walk upon, so he took courage and put out the other foot. Dorothy kept hold of his hand and followed him, and soon they were both walking through the air with the kitten frisking beside them. "Come on, Jim," called the boy. "That's all right." Jim had crept to the edge of the roof and looked over, and being a sensible horse and quite experienced, he made up his mind that he could go where the others did. So, with a snort and a neigh and a whisk of his short tail, he trotted off the roof into the air, and at once began floating downward to the street. His great weight made him fall faster than the children walked, and he passed them on the way down, but when he came to the glass pavement, he alighted upon it so softly that he was not even jarred. "Well, well," said Dorothy, drawing a long breath. "What a strange country this is." People began to come out of the glass doors to look at the new arrivals, and pretty soon quite a crowd had assembled. There were men and women, but no children at all, and the folks were all beautifully formed and attractively dressed and had wonderfully handsome faces. There was not an ugly person in all the throng, yet Dorothy was not especially pleased by the appearance of these people, because their features had no more expression than the faces of dolls. They did not smile, nor did they frown, or show either fear or surprise or curiosity or friendliness. They simply stared at the strangers, paying most attention to Jim and Eureka, for they had never before seen either a horse or a cat, and the children bore an outward resemblance to themselves. Pretty soon a man joined the group, who wore a glistening star in the dark hair just over his forehead. He seemed to be a person of authority, for the others pressed back to give him room. After turning his composed eyes first upon the animals, and then upon the children, he said to Zeb, who was a little taller than Dorothy, "Tell me, intruder, was it you who caused the rain of stones?" For a moment the boy did not know what he meant by this question. Then, remembering the stones that had fallen with them and passed them long before they had reached this place, he answered, "No, sir, we didn't cause anything. It was the earthquake." The man with the star stood for a time quietly thinking over this speech. Then he asked, "What is an earthquake?" "I don't know," said Zeb, who was still confused. But Dorothy, seeing his perplexity, answered, "It's a shaking of the earth. In this quake a big crack opened, and we fell through, horse and buggy and all, and the stones got loose and came down with us." The man with the star regarded her with his calm, expressionless eyes. "The rain of stones has done much damage to our city," he said, "and we shall hold you responsible for it unless you can prove your innocence." "How can we do that?" asked the girl. "That I am not prepared to say. It is your affair, not mine. You must go to the house of the sorcerer who will soon discover the truth. "Where's the house of the sorcerer?" the girl inquired. "I will lead you to it. Come." He turned and walked down the street, and after a moment's hesitation, Dorothy caught Eureka in her arms and climbed into the buggy. The boy took his seat beside her and said, "Get up, Jim." As the horse ambled along, drawing the buggy, the people of the glass city made way for them and formed a procession in their rear. Slowly they moved down one street and up another, turning first this way and then that, until they came to an open square, in the center of which was a great big glass palace, having a central dome and 4 tall spires on each corner. That was a long chapter. I'll take a little bit of a break. So, Drink, good to see you. Have you been doing any story times, or have you stopped for the moment? I know that you're planning on doing Coraline when October comes. And Swags, I really appreciate you hanging out. I know in about an hour you'll be starting your stream. And I'll probably be rating you after a little bit of a game stream after this story time. Oh, that was 2 chapters. Hang on a second. How was that? Oh, yeah, the Glass City. My bad. I completely forgot about that chapter break. So, we are now at the 3rd chapter. The Arrival of the Wizard. The doorway of the glass palace was quite big enough for the horse and the buggy to enter, so Zeb drove straight through it, and the children found themselves in a lofty hall that was very beautiful. The people at once followed and formed a circle around the sides of the spacious room, leaving the horse and buggy and the man with the star to occupy the center of the hall. "Come to us, old Gwig," called the man in a loud voice. Instantly a cloud of smoke appeared and rolled over the floor. Then it slowly spread and ascended into the dome, disclosing a strange personage seated upon a glass throne just before Jim's nose. He was formed just as were the other inhabitants of this land, and his clothing only differed from theirs in being bright yellow. But he had no hair at all, and all over his bald head and face and upon the backs of his hands grew sharp thorns like those found on the branches of rose bushes. There was even a thorn upon the tip of his nose, and he looked so funny that Dorothy laughed when she saw him. The sorcerer, hearing the laugh, looked towards the little girl with cold, cruel eyes, and his glance made her grow sober in an instant. "Why have you dared to intrude your unwelcome persons into the secluded land of the Mangaboos?" he asked sternly. "Because we couldn't help it," said Dorothy. "Why did you wickedly and viciously send the rain of stones to crack and break our houses?" he continued. "We didn't," declared the girl. "Prove it," cried the sorcerer. "We don't have to prove it," answered Dorothy indignantly. "If you had any sense at all, you'd know it was the earthquake. We only know that yesterday came a rain of stones upon us, which did much damage and injured some of our people. Today came another rain of stones, and soon after it you appeared among us." "By the way," said the man with the star, looking steadily at the sorcerer, "you told us yesterday that there would be not a second rain of stones. Yet one has just occurred that was even worse than the first. What is your sorcery good for if it cannot tell us the truth?" "My sorcery does tell the truth," declared the thorn-covered man. "I said there would be but one rain of stones. The second one was a rain of people and horses and buggy, and some stones came with them." "Will there be more rains?" asked the man with the star. "No, my prince." "Neither stones nor people?" "No, my prince." "Are you sure?" "Quite sure, my prince. My sorcery tells me so. Just then a man came running into the hall and addressed the prince after making a low bow. "More wonders in the air, my lord," said he. Immediately the prince and all of his people flocked out of the hall into the street, that they might see what was about to happen. Dorothy and Zeb jumped out of the buggy and ran after them, but the sorcerer remained calmly in his throne. Far up in the air was an object that looked like a balloon. It was not so high as the glowing star of the 6-colored suns, but was descending slowly through the air, so slowly that at first it scarcely seemed to move. The throng stood still and waited. It was all they could do, for to go away and leave that strange sight was impossible, nor could they hurry its fall in any way. The Earth Children were not noticed, being so near the average size of the Mungaboos, and the horse had remained in the house of the sorcerer, with Eureka curled up asleep on the seat of the buggy. Gradually the balloon grew bigger, which was proof that it was settling down upon the land of the Mungaboos. Dorothy was surprised to find how patient the people were, for her own little heart was beating rapidly with excitement. The balloon meant to her some other arrival from the surface of the earth, and she hoped it would be someone able to assist her and Zeb out of their difficulties. In an hour the balloon had come near enough for her to see a basket suspended below it. In 2 hours she could see a head looking over the side of the basket. In 3 hours the big balloon settled slowly into the great square in which they stood and came to rest on the glass pavement. Then a little man jumped out of the basket, took off his tall hat, and bowed very gracefully to the crowd of Mungaboos around him. He was quite an old little man, and his head was long and entirely bald. "Why," cried Dorothy in amazement, "it's Oz!" The little man looked towards her and seemed as much surprised as she was, but he smiled and bowed as he answered, "Yes, my dear, I am Oz, the Great and Terrible, eh? And you are little Dorothy from Kansas. I remember you very well." "Who did you say it was?" whispered Zeb to the girl. "It's the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Hadn't you heard of him?" Just then the man with the star came and stood before the wizard. "Sir," said he, "why are you here in the land of the Mungaboos?" Didn't know what land it was, my son," returned the man with a pleasant smile. "And to be honest, I didn't mean to visit you when I started out. I live on top of the earth, your honor, which is far better than living inside it. But yesterday I went up in a balloon, and when I came down, I fell into a big crack in the earth caused by an earthquake. I had let so much gas out of my balloon that I could not rise again, and in a few minutes the earth closed over my head. So I continued to descend until I reached this place, and if you will show me a way to get out of it, I'll go with pleasure. Sorry to have troubled you, but it couldn't be helped." The prince had listened with attention. Said he, "This child, who is from the crust of the earth, will like yourself, called you a wizard. Is not a wizard something like a sorcerer?" "It's better," replied Oz promptly. "1 wizard is worth 3 sorcerers." "Ah, you shall prove that," said the prince. "We Mungaboos have, at the present time, one of the most wonderful sorcerers that ever was picked from a bush. But he sometimes makes mistakes. Do you ever make mistakes?" "Never," declared the wizard boldly. "Oh, Oz," said Dorothy, "you made a lot of mistakes when you were in the marvelous land of Oz." "Nonsense," said the little man, turning red, although just then a ray of violet sunlight was on his round face. "Come with me," said the prince to him. "I wish you to meet our sorcerer." The wizard did not like this invitation, but he could not refuse to accept it, so he followed the prince into the great domed hall, and Dorothy and Zeb came after him, while the throng of people trooped in also. There sat the thorny sorcerers in this chair of state, and when the wizard saw him, he began to laugh, uttering comical little chuckles. "What an absurd creature!" he exclaimed. "He may look absurd," said the prince in his quiet voice, "but he is an excellent sorcerer. The only fault I find with him is that he is so often wrong." "I am never wrong," answered the sorcerer. "Only a short time ago you told me there would be no more rain of stones or of people," said the prince. "Well, what then?" "Here is another person descended from the air to prove you were wrong." "One person that cannot be called people," said the sorcerer. If two should come out of the sky, you might with justice say I was wrong, but unless more than one appears, I will hold that I was right." "Very clever," replied the wizard, nodding his head as if pleased. "I am delighted to find humbugs inside the earth, just the same as on top of it. Were you ever with a circus, brother?" "No," said the sorcerer. "You ought to join one," declared the little man seriously. "I belong to Balaam and Barney's great consolidated show. 3 rings and 1 tent, and a menagerie on the side. It's a fine aggregation, I assure you." "What do you do?" asked the sorcerer. "I go up in a balloon, usually, to draw the crowds to the circus. But I've just had the bad luck to come out of the sky, skip the solid earth, and land lower down than I intended. But never mind, it isn't everybody who gets a chance to see your land, the Gabazoos. Mongaboos," said the sorcerer, correcting him. "If you are a wizard, you ought to be able to call people by their right names." "Oh, I am a wizard." "You may be sure of that. Just as good a wizard as you are a sorcerer." "That remains to be seen," said the other. "If you are able to prove that you are better," said the prince to the little man, "I will make you the chief wizard of this domain. Otherwise—" "What will happen otherwise?" asked the wizard. "I will stop you from living, and forbid you to be planted," returned the prince. "That does not sound especially pleasant," said the little man, looking at the one with the star uneasily. "But never mind, I'll beat old Prickly all right." "My name is Gwig," said the sorcerer, turning his heartless, cruel eyes upon his rival. "Let me send you equal the sorcery I am about to perform. Let me see you equal the sorcery I am about to perform." He waved a thorny hand, and at once the tinkling of bells was heard, playing sweet music. Yet, look where she would, Dorothy could discover no bells at all in the great glass hall. The Mongaboo people listened, but showed no great interest. It was one of the things Gwig usually did to prove he was a sorcerer. Now was the wizard's turn, so he smiled upon the assemblage and asked, "Will someone kindly loan me a hat?" No one did, because the Mongaboos did not wear hats, and Zeb had lost his, somehow, in his flight through the air. "Ahem," said the wizard. "Will somebody please loan me a handkerchief?" But they had no handkerchiefs either. "Very good," remarked the wizard. "I will use my own hat, if you please. Now, good people, observe me carefully. You see, there is nothing up my sleeves, and nothing concealed about my person. Also, my hat is quite empty." He took off his hat and held it upside down, shaking it briskly. "Let me see it," said the sorcerer. He took the hat and examined it carefully, returning it afterwards to the wizard. "Now," said the little man, "I will create something out of nothing." He placed the hat upon the glass floor, made a pass with his hand, and then removed the hat, displaying a little white piglet no bigger than a mouse, which began to run around here and there and to grunt and squeal in a tiny shrill voice. The people watched it intently, for they had never seen a pig before, big or little. The wizard reached out, caught the wee creature in his hand, and holding his head between one thumb and finger, and its tail between the other thumb and finger, he pulled it apart, each of the 2 parts becoming a whole and separate piglet in an instant. He placed one upon the floor so that it could run around, and pulled apart the other, making 3 piglets in all, and then one of these was pulled apart, making 4 piglets. The wizard continued this surprising performance until 9 tiny piglets were running about at his feet, all squealing and grunting in a very comical way. "Now," said the Wizard of Oz, "having created something from nothing, I will make something nothing again." With this he caught up 2 of the piglets and pushed them together so that the 2 were one. Then he caught up another piglet and pushed it into the first, and where it disappeared. And so, one by one, the 9 tiny piglets were pushed together until but a single one of the creatures remained. This the wizard placed underneath his hat and made a mystic sign above it. Then he removed his hat. The last piglet had disappeared entirely. The little man gave a bow to the silent throng that had watched him, and then the prince said in his cold, calm voice, "You are indeed a wonderful wizard, and your powers are greater than those of my sorcerer. You will not be a wonderful wizard long," remarked Gwig. "Why not?" inquired the wizard. "Because I am going to stop your breath," was the reply. "I perceive that you are curiously constructed, and that if you cannot breathe, you cannot keep alive." The little man looked troubled. "How long will it take you to stop my breath?" he asked. "About 5 minutes. I'm going to begin now. Watch me carefully." He began making queer signs and passing toward the wizard, but the little man did not watch him long. Instead, he drew a lantern case from his pocket and took from it several sharp knives, which he joined together, one after another, until they made a long sword. By the time he had attached a handle to his sword, he was having much trouble to breathe, as the charm of the sorcerer was beginning to take effect. So the wizard lost no more time, but leaping forward, he raised the sharp sword, whirled it once or twice around his head, and then gave a mighty stroke that cut the body of the sorcerer exactly in two. Dorothy screamed and expected to see a terrible sight, but as the 2 halves of the sorcerer fell apart on the floor, she saw that he had no bones or blood inside of him at all, and that the place where he was cut looked like a sliced turnip or potato. "Why, he's a vegetable!" cried the wizard, astonished. "Of course," said the prince. "We are all vegetables in this country. Are you not vegetable also?" "No," answered the wizard. "People on top of the earth are all meat. Will your sorcerer die?" "Certainly, sir. He is really dead now, and will wither very quickly, so we must plant him at once. What other sorcerers may grow upon his bush? That other sorcerers may grow upon his bush," continued the prince. "What do you mean by that?" asked the little wizard, greatly puzzled. "If you will accompany us to our public gardens," replied the prince, "I will explain to you much better than I can here the mysteries of our vegetable kingdom." Sorry, just taking a look at something. We're between chapters again. Chapter 4. The Vegetable Kingdom. After the wizard had wiped the dampness from his sword and taken it apart and put the pieces into their leathern case again, the man with the star ordered some of his people to carry the 2 halves of the sorcerer to the public gardens. Jim pricked up his ears when he heard that they were going to the gardens, and wanted to join the party, thinking he might find something proper to eat. So Zeb put down the top of the buggy and invited the wizard to ride with them. The seat was amply wide enough for the little man and the 2 children, and when Jim started to leave the hall, the kitten jumped upon his back and sat there quite contentedly. Sorry, bad allergy day. So the procession moved through the streets. The bearers of the sorcerer... Sorry. It's all coming all at once. So fun. So the procession moved through the streets. The bearers of the sorcerer first, the prince next, then Jim drawing the buggy with the strangers inside of it, and last the crowd of vegetable people who had no hearts and could neither smile nor frown. The glass city had several fine streets, for a good many people lived there, but when the procession had passed through these, it came upon a broad plain covered with gardens, and watered by many pretty brooks that flowed through it. There were paths through these gardens, and over some of the brooks were ornamental glass bridges. Dorothy and Zeb now got out of the buggy and walked beside the prince so that they might see and examine the flowers and plants better. "Who built these lovely bridges?" asked the little girl. "No one built them," answered the man with the star. "They grow." "That's queer," she said. "Did the glass houses in your city grow too?" "Of course," he replied, "but it took a good many years for them to grow as large and fine as they are now. That is why we are so angry when a rain of stones came to break our towers and crack our roofs." "Can't you mend them?" she inquired. "No, but they will grow together again in time, and we must wait until they do." They first passed through many beautiful gardens of flowers which grew nearest the city, but Dorothy could hardly tell what kind of flowers they were, because the colors were constantly changing under the shifting lights of the 6 suns. A flower would be pink one second, white the next, then blue or yellow, and it was the same way when they came to the plants, which had broad leaves and grew close to the ground. When they passed over a field of grass, Jim immediately stretched down his head and began to nibble. "A nice country, this," he grumbled, "where a respectable horse has to eat pink grass." "It's violet," said the wizard, who was in the buggy. "Now it's blue," complained the horse. "As a matter of fact, I'm eating rainbow grass." "How does it taste?" asked the wizard. "Not bad at all," said Jim. "If they give me plenty of it, I'll not complain about its color." By this time the party had reached a freshly plowed field, and the prince said to Dorothy, "This is our planting ground." Several mongoboos came forward with great spades and dug a hole in the ground. Then they put the 2 halves of the sorcerer into it and covered him up. After that, other people brought water from a brook and sprinkled the earth. "He will sprout very soon," said the prince, "and grow into a large bush from which we shall in time be able to pick several very good sorcerers." "Do all your people grow on bushes?" asked the boy. "Certainly," was the reply. "Do not all people grow upon bushes where you come from, on the outside of the earth?" "Not that I ever heard of." "How strange. But if you will come with me to one of our folk gardens, I will show you the way we grow in the land of the mongoboos." It appeared that these odd people, while they were able to walk through the air with ease, usually moved upon the ground in the ordinary way. There were no stairs in their houses, because they did not need them, but on a level surface they generally walked just as we do. The little party of strangers now followed the prince across a few more of the glass bridges, and along several paths until they came to a garden enclosed by a high hedge. Jim had refused to leave the field of grass where he was engaged in busily eating, so the wizard got out of the buggy and joined Zeb and Dorothy, and the kitten followed demurely at their heels. Inside the hedge they came upon row after row of large and handsome plants, with broad leaves gracefully curving until their points nearly reached the ground. In the center of each plant grew a daintily dressed mongaboo, for the clothes of all these creatures grew upon them and was attached to their bodies. The growing mongaboos were of all sizes, from the blossom that had just turned into a wee baby to the full-grown and almost ripe man or woman. On some of the bushes might be seen a bud, a blossom, a baby, a half-grown person, and a ripe one, but even those ready to pluck were motionless and silent, as if devoid of life. This sight explained to Dorothy why she had seen no children among the mongaboos, a thing which she had until now been unable to account for. "Our people do not acquire their real life until they leave their bushes," said the prince. "You will notice that they are all attached to the plants by the soles of their feet, and when they are quite ripe they are easily separated from the stems, and at once attain the power of motion and speech. So, while they grow, they cannot be said to really live, and they must be picked before they can become good citizens." "How long do you live after you are picked?" asked Dorothy. "That depends upon the care we take of ourselves. he replied. If we keep cool and moist, and meet with no accidents, we often live for 5 years. I've been picked over 6 years, but our family is known to be especially long-lived. Do you eat? Asked the boy. Eat? No, indeed. We are quite solid inside our bodies and have no need to eat any more than does a potato. But the potato sometimes sprouts, said Zeb. And sometimes we do, answered the prince. But that is considered a great misfortune, for then we must be planted at once. Where did you grow? Said the wizard. I'll show you, was the reply. Step this way, please. He led them within another but smaller circle of hedge, where grew one large and beautiful bush. This, said he, is the royal bush of the Mongaboos. All of our princes and rulers have grown upon this one bush from time immemorial. They stood before it in silent admiration. On the central stalk stood poised the figure of a girl so exquisitely formed and colored, and so lovely in the expression of her delicate features, that Dorothy thought that she had never seen so sweet and adorable a creature in all of her life. The maiden's gowns were soft as satin and fell about her in ample folds, while dainty lace-like traceries trimmed the bodice and sleeves. Her flesh was fine and smooth as polished ivory, and her poise expressed both dignity and grace. "Who is it?" asked the wizard curiously. The prince had been staring hard at the girl on the bush. Now he answered with a touch of uneasiness in his cold tones. "She is the ruler destined to be my successor, for she is a royal princess. When she becomes fully ripe, I must abandon the sovereignty of the Mongaboos to her." "Isn't she ripe now?" asked Dorothy. He hesitated. "Not quite," said he finally. "It will be several days before she needs to be picked, or at least that is my judgment. I am in no hurry to resign my office and be planted, you may be sure." "Probably not," declared the wizard, nodding. "This is one of the most unpleasant things about our vegetable lives," continued the prince with a sigh, "that while we are in our full prime, we must give way to another and be covered up in the ground to sprout and grow and give birth to other people." "I'm sure the princess is ready to be picked," asserted Dorothy, gazing hard at the beautiful girl on the bush. "She's as perfect as she can be." "Never mind," said the prince hastily. "She will be all right for a few days longer, and it is best for me to rule until I can dispose of you strangers who have come to our land uninvited and must be attended to at once. Oh, hey, Kickin'. I'm good. How are you? How was school last week?" Really quickly. Oh, we're almost done with the chapter, so I'll reply at the end of that. "What are you going to do with us?" asked Zeb. "That is a matter I have not quite decided upon," was the reply. "I think I shall keep this wizard until a new sorcerer is ready to pick, for he seems quite skillful and may be of use to us. But the rest of you must be destroyed in some time, and you cannot be planted, because I do not wish horses and cats and meat people growing all over our country." "You needn't worry," said Dorothy. "We wouldn't grow underground, I am sure." "But why destroy my friends?" asked the little wizard. "Why not let them live?" "They do not belong here," returned the prince. "They have no right to be inside the earth at all." "We didn't ask to come down here. We fell," said Dorothy. "That is no excuse," declared the prince coldly. The children looked at each other in perplexity, and the wizard sighed. Eureka rubbed her paw on her face and said in her soft, purring voice, He won't need to destroy me, for if I don't get something to eat pretty soon, I shall starve to death and so save him the trouble." If he planted you, he might grow some cattails," suggested the wizard. "Oh, Eureka! Perhaps we can find you some milkweeds to eat," said the boy. "Phoo!" snarled the kitten. "I wouldn't touch the nasty things." "You don't need milk, Eureka," remarked Dorothy. "You're big enough now to eat any kind of food." If I can get it, added Eureka. I'm hungry myself, said Zeb, but I noticed some strawberries growing in one of the gardens and some melons in another place. These people don't eat such things, so perhaps on our way back they will let us get them. Never mind your hunger, interrupted the prince. I shall order you destroyed in a few minutes, so you will have no need to ruin our pretty melon vines and berry bushes. Follow me, please, to meet your doom. Okay, I'm between chapters now. Oh, you've been playing Dead by Daylight? Nice. I like when you can, make improvements in a game and have fun at the same time. I have just, been working and doing story times, of course. It's been very smoky here. And actually, I keep forgetting about it. There have been the rolling blackouts, like the planned blackouts to help alleviate some of the fire danger. Though, oh, nice. Yes, please post it in the Discord. I would love to see it. Quickly checking something. Oh, sorry, I was just looking at the Discord. Mr. Multi posted up a picture of a sleeping kitty. I love all of the kitty pictures that he posts up. I can definitely say that you are better than me. I'm glad to hear how you're doing. I've been wondering how school's been going. What I had heard school is going to be like here in California, and they've changed their mind on that, because originally it was going, at least at the high school closer to me, the one that I used to go to, they were originally going to do half of the students going the first 2 days, one day for a complete clean of the school, and then on the last 2 days of the week, the other half of the students go. But they decided to just go all online learning. Ooh, foam cardboard. Oh, is that like, no, it's not poster board that they call it, but it's like the 2 pieces of paper with some foam inside it. That sort of stuff. Ooh, nice. I'm looking forward to seeing it. Ooh. Sorry about this. Alright, so I'll go ahead and continue. We might be able to do 4 more chapters, it looks like, because that was 4 chapters for the first hour. Chapter 5, Dorothy Picks the Princess. The words of the cold and moist vegetable prince were not very comforting, and as he spoke to them, he turned away and left the enclosure. The children, feeling sad and despondent, were about to follow him when the wizard touched Dorothy softly on his shoulder. "Wait," he whispered. "What for?" asked the girl. "Suppose we pick the royal princess," said the wizard. "I'm quite sure she's ripe, and as soon as she comes to life, she will be the ruler and may treat us better than that heartless prince intends to." "All right," exclaimed Dorothy eagerly. "Let's pick her while we have the chance, before the man with the star comes back." So together they leaned over the great bush, and each of them seized one hand of the lovely princess. "Pull!" cried Dorothy, and as they did so, the royal lady leaned toward them, and the stems snapped and separated from her feet. She was not at all heavy, so the wizard and Dorothy managed to lift her gently to the ground. The beautiful creature passed her hands over her eyes an instant, tucked in a stray lock of hair that had become disarranged. and after a look around the garden, made those present a gracious bow and said in a sweet but even-toned voice, "I thank you very much." "We salute your Royal Highness," cried the wizard, kneeling and kissing her hand. Just then the voice of the prince was heard calling upon them to hasten, and a moment later he returned to the enclosure, followed by a number of his people. Instantly the princess turned and faced him, and when he saw that she was picked, the prince stood still and began to tremble. "Sir," said the royal lady with much dignity, "you have wronged me greatly, and would have wronged me still more, had not these strangers come to my rescue. I have been ready for picking all the past week, but because you were selfish and desired to continue your unlawful rule, you left me to stand silent upon my bush." "I did not know that you were ripe," answered the prince in a low voice. "Give me the star of royalty," she commanded. Slowly he took the shining star from his own brow and placed it upon that of the princess. Then all the people bowed low to her, and the prince turned and walked away alone. What became of him afterward, our friends never knew. The people of Mangaboo now formed themselves into a procession and marched towards the glass city to escort their new ruler to her palace and to perform those ceremonies proper to the occasion. But while the people in the procession walked upon the ground, the princess walked in the air just above their heads, to show that she was a superior being and more exalted than her subjects. No one now seemed to pay any attention to the strangers, so Dorothy and Zeb and the wizard let the train pass on, and then wandered by themselves into the vegetable gardens. They did not bother to cross the bridges over the brooks, but when they came to a stream, they stepped high and walked in the air to the other side. This was a very interesting experience to them, and Dorothy said, "I wonder why it is that we can walk so easily in the air." "Perhaps," answered the wizard, "it is because we are close to the center of the earth, where the attraction of gravity is very slight. But I've noticed that many queer things happen in fairy countries." "Is this a fairy country?" asked the boy. "Of course it is," returned Dorothy promptly. "Only a fairy country could have vegetable people, and only in a fairy country could Eureka and Jim talk as we do." "That's true," said Zeb thoughtfully. In the vegetable gardens they found the strawberries and melons and several other unknown but delicious fruits, of which they ate heartily. But the kitten bothered them constantly by demanding milk or meat, and called the wizard names because he could not bring her a dish of milk by means of his magical arts. As they sat upon the grass watching Jim, who was still busily eating, Eureka said, "I don't believe you are a wizard at all." "No," answered the little man, "you are quite right. In the strict sense of the word, I am not a wizard, but only a humbug." "The Wizard of Oz has always been a humbug," agreed Dorothy. "I've known him for a long time." "If that's so," said the boy, "how did he do that wonderful trick with the 9 tiny piglets?" "Don't know," said Dorothy, "but it must have been a humbug." "Very true," declared the wizard, nodding at her. "It was necessary to deceive that ugly sorcerer and the prince, as well as their stupid people, but I don't mind telling you, who are my friends, that the thing was only a trick." "But I saw the little pigs with my own eyes," exclaimed Zeb. "So did I," purred the kitten. "To be sure," answered the wizard. "You saw them because they were there. They are in my inside pocket now, but the pulling of them apart and pushing them together again was only a sleight-of-hand trick." "Let's see the pigs," said Eureka eagerly. The little man felt carefully in his pocket and pulled out the tiny piglets, settling them upon the grass one by one, where they ran around and nibbled the tender blades. "They're hungry too," he said. "Oh, what cunning things!" replied Dorothy, catching up one and petting it. "Be careful," said the piglet with a squeal. "You're squeezing me." "Dear me," murmured the wizard, looking at his pets in astonishment. "They can actually talk." "May I eat one of them?" asked the kitten in a pleading voice. "I'm awfully hungry." "Why, Eureka!" said Dorothy reproachfully. "What a cruel question! It would be dreadful to eat these dear little things." "I should say so," grunted another of the piglets, looking uneasily at the kitten. "Cats are cruel things." "I'm not cruel," replied the kitten, yawning. "I'm just hungry." "You cannot eat my piglets, even if you are starving," declared the little man in a stern voice. "These are the only things that I have to prove I'm a wizard." How did they happen to be so little?" asked Dorothy. "I never saw such small pigs before." "They are from the island of Teeny-Weent," said the wizard, "where everything is small because of it's a small island. A sailor brought them to Los Angeles, and I gave him 9 tickets to the circus for them." "But what am I going to eat?" wailed the kitten, sitting in front of Dorothy and looking pleadingly into her face. "There are no cows here to give milk, or any mice, or even grasshoppers. And if I can't eat the piglets, you may as well just plant me at once and raise cats up." "I have an idea," said the wizard, "that there are fishes in these brooks. Do you like fish?" "Fish!" cried the kitten. "Oh, do I like fish? Why, they're better than piglets, or even milk." "Then I'll try to catch you some," said he. "But won't they be vegetable like everything else here?" asked the kitten. "I think not. Fishes are not animals, and they are as cold and moist as the vegetables themselves. There is no reason that I can see why they may not exist in the waters of this strange country." Then the wizard bent a pin for a hook and took a long piece of string from his pocket for a fish line. The only bait he could find was a bright red blossom from a flower, but he knew fishes are very easy to fool if anything bright attracts their attention, so he decided to try the blossom. Having thrown the end of his line in the water of a nearby brook, he soon felt a sharp tug that told him a fish had bitten and was caught on the bent pin. So the little man drew in the string, and sure enough, the fish came with it and was landed safely on the shore, where it began to flop around in great excitement. The fish was flat and round, and its scales glistened like beautifully cut jewels set close together, but there was no time to examine it closely, for Eureka made a jump and caught it between her claws, and in a few minutes it had entirely disappeared. "Oh, Eureka!" cried Dorothy. "Did you eat the bones?" "If it had any bones, I ate them," replied the kitten composedly, as it washed its face after the meal. "But I don't think the fish had any bones, because I didn't feel them scratch my throat." "You were very greedy," said the girl. "I was very hungry," replied the kitten. The little pigs had stood huddled in a group, watching the scene with frightened eyes. "Cats are dreadful creatures," said one of them. "I'm glad we are not fishes," said another. "Don't worry," Dorothy murmured soothingly. "I'll not let the kitten hurt you." Then she happened to remember that in a corner of her suitcase were 1 or 2 crackers, which were left over from her luncheon on the train, and she went to the buggy and brought them. Eureka stuck up her nose at such food, but the tiny piglets squealed delightedly at the sight of the crackers and ate them up in a jiffy. "Now let us go back to the city," suggested the wizard. "That is, if Jim has had enough of the pink grass." The cab horse, who was browsing nearby, lifted his head with a sigh. "I've tried to eat a lot while I had the chance," said he, "for it's likely to be a long while between meals in this strange country. But I'm ready to go now at any time you wish." So after the wizard had put the piglets back into his inside pocket, where they cuddled up and went to sleep, the 3 climbed into the buggy, and Jim started back to the town. "Where shall we stay?" asked the girl. "I think I shall take possession of the house of the sorcerer," replied the wizard, "for the prince said in the presence of his people that he would keep me until they picked another sorcerer, and the new princess won't know but that we belong there." They agreed to this plan, and when they reached the great square, Jim drew the buggy into the big door of the domed hall. It doesn't look very homelike, said Dorothy, gazing around at the bare room. But it's a place to stay anyhow. What are those holes up there? Inquired the boy, pointing to some openings that appeared near the top of the dome. They look like doorways, said Dorothy, only there are no stairs to get to them. You forget that stairs are unnecessary, observed the wizard. Let us walk up and see where the doors lead to. With this, he began walking in the air toward the high openings, and Dorothy and Zeb followed him. It was the same sort of climb one experiences when walking up a hill, and they were nearly out of breath when they came to the row of openings which they perceived to be doorways leading into halls in the upper part of the house. Following these halls, they discovered many small rooms opening from them, and some were furnished with glass benches, tables, and chairs. But there were no beds at all. I wonder if these people never sleep, said the girl. Why, there seems to be no night at all in this country, Zeb replied. Those colored suns are exactly in the same place they were when we came, and if there is no sunset, there can be no night. Very true, agreed the wizard, but it is a long time since I have had any sleep, and I'm tired, so I think I should lie down upon one of these hard glass benches and take a nap. I will too, said Dorothy, and chose a little room at the end of the hall. Zeb walked down again to unharness Jim, who, when he found himself free, rolled over a few times and then settled down to sleep, with Eureka nestling comfortably beside him, his big bony body. Then the boy returned to one of the upper rooms, and in spite of the hardness of the glass bench, was soon deep in slumberland. I'm going to take a small break. I will be right back. Oh, interesting. Sorry, I just read what you had said, Kickin. How are you enjoying it? Do you like international football better than rugby? I'll switch over to my Storytime image. So continuing, Chapter 6, The Mangaboos Prove Dangerous. When the wizard awoke, the 6 colored suns were shining down upon the land of the Mongoboos, just as they had done ever since his arrival. I just realized why all the houses are glass, because they're greenhouses. The little man, having had a good sleep, felt rested and refreshed, and looking through the glass partition of the room, he saw Zeb sitting up in his bed and yawning. So the wizard went into him. Oh, on his bench. Sorry, not bed. "Zeb," said he, "my balloon is of no further use in this strange country, so I may as well leave it on the square where it fell. But in the basket car are some things I would like to keep with me. I wish you would go fetch my satchel, 2 lanterns, and a can of kerosene oil that is under the seat. There's nothing else that I care about." So the boy went willingly upon the errand, and by the time he had returned, Dorothy was awake. Then the 3 held a council to decide what they should do next, but could think of no way to better their condition. "I don't like these vegetable people," said the little girl. "They're cold and flabby like cabbages in spite of their prettiness." "I agree with you. It is because there is no warm blood in them," remarked the wizard. "And they have no hearts, so they can't move anyone, not even themselves," declared the boy. "The princess is lovely to look at," continued Dorothy thoughtfully, "but I don't care much for her after all. If there was any other place to go, I'd like to go there." "But is there any other place?" asked the wizard. "I don't know," she answered. Just then they heard the big voice of Jim the cab horse calling to them, and going to the doorway leading to the dome, they found the princess and a throng of people had entered the house of the sorcerer. So they went down to greet the beautiful vegetable lady, who said to them, "I have been talking with my advisors about you meat people, and we have decided that you do not belong in the land of the Mongoboos and must not remain here." "How can we go away?" asked Dorothy. "Oh, you cannot go away, of course, so you must be destroyed," was the answer. "In what way?" inquired the wizard. "We shall throw you 3 people into the garden of the twining vines," said the princess, "and they will soon crush you and devour your bodies to make themselves grow bigger. The animals you have with you we will drive to the mountains and put into the black pit. Then our country will be rid of all of its unwelcome visitors." "But you are in need of a sorcerer," said the wizard, "and not one of those growing is yet ripe enough to pick. I am greater than any thorn-covered sorcerer that ever grew in your garden. Why destroy me?" "It is true that we need a sorcerer," acknowledged the princess, "but I am informed that one of our own will be ready to pick in a few days to take the place of Gwig, whom you cut in 2 before it was time for him to be planted. Let us see your arts and the sorceries you are able to perform. Then I will decide whether to destroy you with the others or not." At this, the wizard made a bow to the people and repeated his trick of producing the 9 tiny piglets and making them disappear again. He did it very cleverly indeed, and the princess looked at the strange piglets as if she were as truly astonished as any vegetable person could be. But afterwards she said, "I have heard of this wonderful magic, but it accomplishes nothing of value. What else can you do?" The wizard tried to think. Then he jointed together the blades of his sword and balanced it very skillfully upon the end of his nose. But even that did not satisfy the princess. Just when his eye fell upon the lanterns and the can of kerosene oil which Zeb had brought from the car of his balloon, and he got a clever idea from these commonplace things. "Your Highness," said he, "I will now proceed to prove my magic by creating 2 suns that you have never seen before. Also, I will exhibit a destroyer, much more dreadful than your clinging vines." So he placed Dorothy upon one side of him and the boy upon the other, and set a lantern upon each of their heads. "Don't laugh," he whispered to them, "or you will spoil the effect of my magic." Then, with much dignity and a look of vast importance upon his wrinkled face, the wizard got out his matchbox and lighted the 2 lanterns. glare they made was very small when compared with the radiance of the 6 great colored suns, but still they gleamed steadily and clearly. The Mangaboos were much impressed because they had never before seen any light that did not come directly from their suns. Next, the wizard poured a pool of oil from the can upon the glass floor, where it covered quite a broad surface. Then he lighted the oil. 100 tongues of flame shot up, and the effect was really imposing. "Now, Princess," exclaimed the wizard, "those of your advisers who wished to throw us into the garden of clinging vines must step within this circle of light. If they advised you well and were in the right, they will not be injured in any way. But if they advised you wrongly, the light will wither them." The advisers of the princess did not like this test, but she commanded them to step into the flame, and one by one they did so, and were scorched so badly that the air was soon filled with an odor like that of baked potatoes. Some of the Mangaboos fell down and had to be dragged from the fire, and all were so withered that it would be necessary to plant them at once. "Sir," said the princess to the wizard, "you are greater than any sorcerer we have ever seen. As it is evident that my people have advised me wrongly, I will not cast you 3 people into the dreadful garden of the clinging vines, but your animals must be driven into the black pit in the mountain, for my subjects cannot bear to have them around." The wizard was so pleased to have saved the 2 children and himself that he said nothing against this decree. But when the princess had gone, both Jim and Eureka protested they did not want to go to the black pit, and Dorothy promised she would do all that she could to save them from such a fate. For 2 or 3 days after this, if we call days the periods between sleep, there being no night to divide the hours into days, our friends were not disturbed in any way. They were even permitted to occupy the house of the sorcerer in peace, as if it had been their own, and to wander in the gardens in search of food. Once they came near to the enclosed garden of the clinging vines, and walked high into the air, looked down upon it with much interest. They saw a mass of tough green vines all matted together and writhing and twisting round like a nest of great snakes. Everything the vines touched they crushed, and our adventurers were indeed thankful to have escaped being cast upon them. Whenever the wizard went to sleep, they would take the 9 tiny piglets from his pocket and let them run around on the floor of his room to amuse themselves and get some exercise. And one time they found his glass door ajar and wandered into the hall and then into the bottom part of the great dome, walking through the air as easily as Eureka could. They knew the kitten by this time, so they scrambled over to where she lay beside Jim and commenced to frisk and play with her. The cab horse, who never slept long at a time, sat upon his haunches and watched the tiny piglets and the kitten with much approval. "Don't be rough," he would call out if Eureka knocked over one of the round, fat piglets with her paw, but the pigs never minded and enjoyed the sport very greatly. Suddenly they looked up to find the room filled with the silent, solemn-eyed Mangaboos. Each of the vegetable folks bore a branch covered with sharp thorns, which was thrust defiantly toward the horse, the kitten, and the piglets. "Here! Stop this foolishness!" Jim roared angrily, but after being pricked once or twice, he got up upon his 4 legs and kept out of the way of the thorns. The Mangaboos surrounded them in solid ranks, but left an opening to the doorway of the hall, so the animals slowly retreated until they were driven from the room and out upon the street. Here were more of the vegetable people with thorns, and silently they urged the now frightened creatures down the street. Jim had to be careful not to step upon the tiny piglets, who scrambled under his feet, grunting and squealing, while Eureka, snarling and biting at the thorns pushing toward her, also tried to protect the pretty little things from injury. Slowly but steadily the heartless Mangaboos drove them on until they had passed through the city and the gardens, and come to the broad plains leading to the mountain. "What does all this mean, anyhow?" asked the horse, jumping to escape a thorn. "Why, they are driving us toward the black pit, into which they threatened to cast us," replied the kitten. "If I were as big as you were, Jim, I'd fight those miserable turnip roots." "What would you do?" inquired Jim. "I'd kick out with those long legs and iron-shod hoofs." "All right," said the horse, "I'll do it." An instant later, he suddenly backed towards the crowd of mongoose and kicked out his hind legs as hard as he could. A dozen of them smashed together and tumbled to the ground, and seeing his success, Jim kicked again and again, charging into the vegetable crowd and knocking them in all directions and sending the others scattering to escape his iron heels. Eureka helped him by flying into the faces of the enemy and scratching and biting furiously, and the kitten ruined so many vegetable complexions that the mongoose feared her as much as they did the horse. But the foes were too many to be repulsed for long. They tired Jim and Eureka out, and although the field of battle was thickly covered with mashed and disabled mongoose, our animal friends had to give up at last and allow themselves to be driven to the mountain. Chapter 7. Into the Black Pit and Out Again. When they came to the mountain, it proved to be a rugged, towering chunk of deep green glass, and looked dismal and forbidding in the extreme. Halfway up the steep was a yawning cave, black as night, beyond the point where the rainbow rays of the colored suns reached into it. The mongoose drove the horse and the kitten and the piglets into the dark hole, and then, having pushed the buggy in after them, for it seemed some of them had dragged it all the way from the domed hall, they began to pile big glass rocks within the entrance so that the prisoners could not get out again. "This is dreadful," groaned Jim. "It will be about the end of our adventures, I guess." "If the wizard was here," said one of the piglets, sobbing bitterly, "he would not see us suffer so." "We ought to have called him and Dorothy when we were first attacked," added Eureka. "But never mind, be brave, my friends, and I will go and tell our masters where you are, and get them to come to your rescue." The mouth of the hole was nearly filled up by now, but the kitten gave a leap through the remaining opening and at once scampered up into the air. The mongoose saw her escape, and several of them caught up their thorns and gave chase, mounting through the air after her. Eureka, however, was lighter than the mongoose, and while they could mount only about 100 feet above the earth, the kitten found she could go nearly 200 feet. So she ran along over their heads until she had left them far behind and below, and had come to the city and the house of the sorcerer. There she entered in at Dorothy's window in the dome and aroused her from her sleep. As soon as the little girl knew what had happened, she awakened the wizard and Zeb, and at once preparations were made to go to the rescue of Jim and the piglets. The wizard carried his satchel, which was quite heavy, and Zeb carried the 2 lanterns and the oil can. Dorothy's wicker suitcase was still under the seat of the buggy, and by good fortune, the boy had also placed the harness of the buggy when he had not taken it off from Jim to let the horse lie down and rest. So there was nothing for the little girl to carry but the kitten, which she held close to her bosom and to try to comfort, for its little heart was still beating rapidly. Some of the mongoose discovered them as soon as they left the house of the sorcerer, but when they started toward the mountain, the vegetable people allowed them to proceed without interference, yet followed in a crowd behind them so that they could not go back again. Before long they neared the black pit, where a busy swarm of mongoose, headed by their princess, was engaged in piling up glass rocks before the entrance. "Stop! I command you!" cried the wizard in an angry tone, and at once began pulling down the rocks to liberate Jim and the piglets. Instead of opposing him in this, they stood back in silence until he made a good-sized hole in the barrier. when, by order of the princess, they all sprang forward and thrust out their sharp thorns. Dorothy hopped inside the opening to escape being pricked, and Zeb and the wizard, after enduring a few stabs from the thorns, were glad to follow her. At once the Mongoose began piling up the rocks of glass again, and as the little man realized that they were all about to be entombed in the mountain, he said to the children, "My dears, what shall we do? Jump out and fight?" "What's the use?" replied Dorothy. "I'd as soon die here as live much longer among these cruel and heartless people." "That's the way I feel about it," remarked Zeb, rubbing his wounds. "I've had enough of the Mongoose." "All right," said the wizard. "I'm with you, whatever you decide. But we can't live long in this cavern, that's certain." Noticing that the light was growing dim, he picked up his 9 piglets, patted each one lovingly on his fat little head, and placed them carefully into his inside pocket. Zeb struck a match and lighted one of the lanterns. The rays of the colored suns were now shut out from them forever, for the last chinks had been filled up in the wall that separated their prison from the land of the Mongoose. "How big is this hole?" asked Dorothy. "I'll explore it and see," replied the boy. So he carried the lantern back for quite a distance, while Dorothy and the wizard followed at his side. The cavern did not come to an end, as they had expected it would, but slanted upwards through the great glass mountain, running in a direction that promised to lead them to the side opposite the Mongoose country. "It isn't a bad road," observed the wizard, "and if we follow it, it might lead us to some place that is more comfortable than this black pocket we are in now. I suppose the vegetable folk are always afraid to enter this cavern because it is so dark. But we have our lanterns to light the way, so I propose that we start out and discover where this tunnel in the mountain leads to." The others agreed readily to this sensible suggestion, and at once the boy began to harness Jim to the buggy. When all was in readiness, the 3 took their seats in the buggy, and Jim started cautiously along the way, Zeb driving, while the wizard and Dorothy each held a lighted lantern so the horse could see where to go. Sometimes the tunnel was so narrow that the wheels of the buggy grazed the sides. Then it would broaden out as wide as a street, but the floor was usually smooth, and for a long time they traveled on without any accident. Jim dropped sometimes to rest, for the climb was rather steep and tiresome. Just taking a small drink. "We mustn't be nearly as high as the 6 colored suns by this time," said Dorothy. "I didn't know this mountain was so tall." "We're certainly a good distance away from the land of the Mongoose," said Zeb, "for we have slanted away from it ever since we started." But they kept steadily moving, and just as Jim was about to tire out with his long journey, the way suddenly grew lighter, and Zeb put out the lanterns to save the oil. To their joy, they found it was a white light that now greeted them, for all were weary of the colored rainbow lights which, after a time, had made their eyes ache with their constantly shifting rays. The sides of the tunnel showed before them like the inside of a long spyglass, and the floor became more level. Jim hastened his lagging steps at this assurance of a quick relief from the dark passage, and in a few moments more they had emerged from the mountain and found themselves face to face with a new and charming country. Chapter 8. The Valley of Voices. By journeying through the glass mountain, they had reached a delightful valley that was shaped like the hollow of a great cup, with another rugged mountain showing up on the other side of it, and soft and pretty green hills at the ends. It was all laid out into lovely lawns and gardens, with pebbled paths leading through them and groves of beautiful and stately trees dotting the landscape here and there. There were orchards, too, bearing luscious fruits that are all unknown in our world. Alluring brooks of crystal water flowed sparkling between their flower-strewn banks, while scattered over the valley were dozens of the quaintest and the most picturesque cottages our travelers had ever beheld. None of them were in clusters, such as villages or towns, but each had ample grounds of their own, with orchards and gardens surrounding it. As the new arrivals gazed upon this exquisite scene, they were enraptured by its beauties and the fragrance that permeated the soft air, which they breathed so gratefully after the confined atmosphere of the tunnel. Several minutes were consumed in silent admiration before they noticed two very singular and unusual facts about this valley. One was that it was lighted from some unseen source, for no sun or moon was in the arched blue sky, although every object was flooded with a clear and perfect light. The second, and even more singular fact, was the absence of any inhabitant of this splendid place. From their elevated position, they could overlook the entire valley, but not a single moving object could they see. All appeared mysteriously deserted. The mountain on this side was not glass, but made of a stone similar to granite. With some difficulty and danger, Jim drew the buggy over the loose rocks until he reached the green lawns below, where the paths and orchards and gardens began. The nearest cottage was still some distance away. "Isn't it fine?" cried Dorothy in a joyous voice, as she sprang out of the buggy and let Eureka run frolicking over the velvety grass. "Yes, indeed," answered Zeb. "You're lucky to get away from those dreadful vegetable people." "It wouldn't be so bad," remarked the Wizard, gazing around them, "if we were obliged to live here always. We couldn't find a prettier place, I'm sure." He took the piglets from his pocket and let them run on the grass, and Jim tasted a mouthful of the grass blades and declared he was very contented in his new surroundings. "We can't walk in the air here, though," called Eureka, who had tried it and failed. But the others were satisfied to walk on the ground, and the Wizard said that they must be nearer the surface of the earth than they had been in the Mangaboo country, for everything was more homelike and natural. "But where are the people?" called Dorothy. The little man shook his bald head. "Can't imagine, my dear," he replied. They heard the sudden twittering of a bird, but could not find the creature anywhere. Slowly they walked along the path toward the nearest cottage, the piglets racing and gambling beside them, and Jim pausing to step at every step for another mouthful of grass. Presently they came to a low plant which had broad, spreading leaves, in the center of which grew a single fruit about as large as a peach. The fruit was so daintily colored and so fragrant, and looked so appetizing and delicious that Dorothy stopped and exclaimed, "What is it, do you suppose?" The piglets had smelled the fruit quickly, and before the girl could reach out her hand to pluck it, every one of the 9 tiny ones had rushed in and commenced to devour it with great eagerness. "It's good anyway," said Zeb, "or those little rascals wouldn't have gobbled it up so greedily." "Where are they?" asked Dorothy in astonishment. They all looked around, but the piglets had disappeared. "Dear me!" cried the Wizard. "They must have run away, but I didn't see them go, did you?" "No," replied the boy and the girl together. "Here, Piggy, Piggy, Piggy," called their master anxiously. Several squeals and grunts were instantly heard at his feet, but the Wizard could not discover a single piglet. "Where are you?" he asked. "Why, right beside you," spoke a tiny voice. "Can't you see us?" "No," answered the little man in a puzzled tone. "We can see you," said another of the piglets. The Wizard stooped down and put out his hand, and at once felt the small fat body of one of his pets. He picked it up, but could not see what he held. "This is a very strange country," said he soberly. "The piglets have become invisible in some curious way." "I'll bet it was because they ate that peach," cried the kitten. "It wasn't a peach, Eureka," said Dorothy. "I only hope it wasn't poison." "It was fine, Dorothy," called one of the piglets. "We'll eat all we can find of them," said another. "But we mustn't eat them," said the wizard. The wizard warned the children, "or we too may become invisible and lose each other. If we come across another of the strange fruit, we must avoid it." Calling the piglets to him, he picked them all up one by one and put them away in his pocket, for although he could not see them, he could feel them, and when he had buttoned his coat, he knew they were safe for the present. The travelers now resumed their walk toward the cottage, which they presently reached. It was a pretty place, with vines growing thickly over the broad front porch. The door stood open, and a table was set in the front room, with 4 chairs drawn up to it. On the table were plates, knives and forks, and dishes of bread and meat and fruits. The meat was smoking hot, and the knives and forks were performing strange antics and jumping here and there in quite a puzzling way. But not a single person appeared to be in the room. "How funny!" exclaimed Dorothy, who with Zeb and the wizard now stood in the doorway. A peal of merry laughter answered her, and the knives and forks fell to the plates with a clatter. One of the chairs pushed back from the table, and this was so astonishing and mysterious that Dorothy was almost tempted to run away in fright. "Here are strangers, Mamma!" cried a shrill and girlish voice with some unseen person. "So I see, my dear," answered another voice, soft and womanly. "What do you want?" demanded the third voice in a stern, gruff accent. "Well, well," said the wizard. "Are there really people in this room?" "Of course," replied the man's voice. "And, pardon me for the foolish question, but are you all invisible?" "Surely," the woman answered, repeating her low, rippling laughter. "Are you surprised that you were unable to see the people of the Voa?" "Why, yes," stammered the wizard. "All the people I have ever met before were very plain to see." "Where do you come from, then?" asked the woman in a curious tone. "We belong upon the surface of the earth," explained the wizard, "but recently, during an earthquake, we fell down a crack and landed in the country of the Mangaboos." "Dreadful creatures!" exclaimed the woman's voice. "I've heard of them." "They walled us up in a mountain," continued the wizard, "but we found there was a tunnel through to this side, so we came here. It is a beautiful place. What do you call it?" "It is the Valley of the Voa." "Thank you. We have seen no people since we arrived, so we came to this house to inquire our way." "Are you hungry?" asked the woman's voice. "I could eat something," said Dorothy. "So could I," added Zeb. "But we do not wish to intrude, I assure you," the wizard hastened to say. "Oh, that's all right," returned the man's voice more pleasantly than before. "You are welcome to what we have." As he spoke, the voice came so near to Zeb that he jumped back in alarm. 2 childish voices laughed merrily at this action, and Dorothy was sure they were in no danger among such light-hearted folk, even if these folk couldn't be seen. "What curious animal is that which has eaten the grass on my lawn?" inquired the man's voice. "That's Jim," said the girl. "He's a horse." "What is he good for?" was the next question. "He draws a buggy you see fastened to him, and we ride in the buggy instead of walking," she explained. "Can he fight?" asked the man's voice. "No. He can kick pretty hard with his heels and bite a little, but Jim can't exactly fight," she replied. "Then the bears will get him," said one of the children's voices. "Bears!" exclaimed Dorothy. "Are there bears here?" "That is the one evil of this country," answered the invisible man. "Many large and fierce bears roam in the Valley of the Voa, and when they catch any of us, they eat us up. But as they cannot see us, we seldom get caught." "Are the bears invisible too?" asked the girl. "Yes, for they eat for the dama fruit, as we all do, and that keeps them from being seen by any eye, whether human or animal." "Does the dama fruit grow in a low bush and look something like a peach?" asked the wizard. "Yes," was the reply. "If it makes you invisible, why do you eat it?" Dorothy inquired. "For 2 reasons, my dear," the woman's voice answered. "The dama fruit is the most delicious thing that grows, and when it makes us invisible, the bears cannot find us to eat us up." But now, good wanderers, your luncheon is on the table, so please sit down and eat as much as you like. So at the end of the 8th chapter, I'm going to go ahead and stop story time for today. I'm going to take a small break, and then I'm going to come back with a Terraria stream, because last night when I was exploring, there was this really cool area that I found down in the caverns with this glowing hot pink grass on the walls. So I am really curious to explore it some more. You never know what you're going to find down there. Anyways, I will end this stream here. I will be back in a few minutes. I hope you stick around. So anyways, I'll see you next time, and have a good day. Bye.